It's a pleasure to have Alex Csiszar. Alex is working on the same problems as we do, but from a very, very different perspective. A few months ago, I was reading either Nature or Science, and then we're kind of talking about his work. And I said, hey, this is interesting. Do we have a person in Boston who kind of looks at citations and journals and all of that from a historical perspective? We're looking at all of that from a data perspective. Let's try to get him here. And to our pleasure, he's actually here to tell us a little bit about his work. Alex, as I said, he's an associate professor of history of science at Harvard. And he has written several books in the space of citation analysis and history of that. I think you have a book coming up, the scientific journals, about journals and what they do for us. Authorship and the Politics of Knowledge in the 19th Century. We had journals then, right? That just about started then.
That's right. And that's in fact that's the
That's right. So it will be really fun to kind of contrast the perspective he brings to the table and the perspective we've been employing for the last many years in this lab. So without further ado, please tell us.
All right, thank you so much. This is one of the rare instances in which somebody actually pronounces my name correctly, which is nice to hear. Anyway,
I shouldn't say Shandor. I didn't say Shandor.
That's true. Well, in fact, my name isn't technically Shandor.
I see.
I was born here, but my parents.
Yes, I hear that.
Thank you for the invite. I've never addressed an audience quite like this. This is going to be very interesting. I really am a historian, which is to say, some historians do deal with big data. I'm actually, even though I study big data, I don't actually do big data. I don't really do data. I kind of go at it from a very different sort of point of view. I do deal with a lot of empirical stuff, but it's mostly sitting in dusty libraries and archival spaces reading correspondence and letters and things like that. And so it's kind of a very different perspective on a set of topics and themes that I think you'll find pretty familiar. And so I should say in my field, we tend to be pretty formal with our talks. I'm going to try to not be too formal. So I don't know if you guys tend to interrupt when people give talks, or do you?
We interrupt only if there's a clarifying question.
Feel free to do so, in fact. I'm going to be very, very informal about this. We'll just go as long as we have time to go, and then I'll just stop wherever we run out of time.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Feel free to say, all right, enough. So the reason I say that is because I've got a lot of stuff that I can talk about, but I don't quite know at what sort of granular detail you guys care. And so, if I go over something, you're like, oh, I want to hear more about that, just say, can you say more about that? You might as well just interrupt me and we can talk more about it. At first I thought I'd do something that was a little more focused on the 20th century stuff that I'm working on now, but in the end, I did something that's a little more overviewy. I'm going to sort of hit some big themes connected to my work in general. Most of what I've done is on the 19th century, and that's what I'm going to mostly talk about, especially in the first 20 minutes or so. Then I'm going to transition to the 20th century citation analysis stuff that I've been working on now. Who knows if we'll get to it. But I imagine the 19th century stuff might be interesting to you. I imagine most of the data you've worked on is 20th century.
It is 20th century. We started 1900.
And there's a good reason not to do the 19th century. As I'll give you reasons why doing the quantitative stuff on the 19th century is tricky, at least. Even though there are some interesting catalogs and things like that that you might be able to marshal and sort of pull data out of to do things with. You might indeed, after this, decide this is a good idea to do. I'm going to try to convince you that you at least should be very careful when you do so. All right, so don't worry about the title today. You can sort of, let's see. Okay, so one of the big questions that animates a lot of what I've been writing about in the last 5 years is, and especially this sort of metric stuff, this catalog stuff, is what kind of thing is science that we might measure? I'm sure this is something you guys are very interested in as well, because indeed you guys do a lot of measuring of science as far as I can tell. And indeed, so this is going to be old hat to you. There's various things you might try to measure. Discovery rates, invention rates, size of the workforce in science, how much money is invested in it, and then various notions of impact, various notions of output. economic impacts, military impacts, that's been very, very important in the history of science. And then perhaps, and this is a weird one, very hard to quantify, broader cultural impacts. So many arguments have been made on behalf of the scientific enterprise that it imbues a society with something bigger than anything economics or military might can muster. But of course, these things are very hard to measure. Indeed, they're hard to define. And so, of course, what we tend to do is we use various kinds of surrogates to do so. Publication counts, citation counts, counts of patents and other kinds of IP, and then, of course, various other sorts of metrics that people are coming up with now and that people have come up with in the past. All right, so the sort of question that goes along with this for me is how do information infrastructures in science, the sorts of things like the citation index, catalogs of publications, Book of Science, how do those information infrastructures mix together with and mutually inform our very conceptions of what a scientific discovery, what scientific progress, what scientific merit is? So my sort of hypothesis, or at least something that I feel has come out of the sources that I've worked with, is that at least in the 19th century, the very conception of what a discovery is and what sort of a meritorious scientific life is interestingly transforming over time in connection with the growth and new uses of things like big catalogs of science. So I'm very interested in things like publication formats and genres, things like the scientific journal. I'll say more about that in a moment, the scientific paper, catalogs and databases that I'm going to say more about in a moment, and then for these days, things like algorithms and metrics for searching for information, but also evaluating individuals, evaluating research programs, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea is that the development of this rather concrete stuff has really sort of important effects on what people imagine science to be for and about. So it's not simply that these things account for something that's out there and is stable, but that thing that you are measuring and accounting for, and et cetera, is itself being shaped by these technologies and infrastructures. So that's kind of the sort of big hypothesis theme that kind of comes out of my research. I'm going to give 2.5 examples of this. Mostly I'm going to focus on the 19th century. I'm going to talk a bit about this work I've done on 19th century catalogs. That's the sort of Nature paper that I think you read that you just said, oh, well, this could be an interesting thing to talk about. And say a bit about that, a little sort of broader history of how I got into that and why I think that's important. Connected to that, what is a scientific paper is a big question that I've sort of written a book about essentially. So I have a lot to say about it, but I won't say too much here. If you want to hear more, just let me know and I can go on and on. And then I might talk a bit about citation analysis, et cetera, et cetera. And here I'm going to focus on a few key actors, Eugene Garfield, founder of Institute for Scientific Information, which built the Science Citation Index. Robert K. Merton. Is Merton an actor for you guys?
Yes,
Do you know who Merton is?
Yes,
kind of,
because he has done a bunch of other things that are relevant.
Yes. So Merton is sort of this sort of grandfather of at least Anglo-American sociology of science. Very interesting figure. And what I've realized in the last year or so researching this is that there's all sorts of interesting connections between the development of the Science Citation Index and various other infrastructures and the emergence of empirical sociology of science in the United States. That's kind of very interesting to me, and it should be to you, and I'll try to explain why in a moment. Okay, so that's what I'm going to talk about. As I said, this is the paper that I think some of you read and thought, oh, well, that's interesting. That seems relevant to what we're doing. The catalog that made metrics and changed science. It's about this 19th century catalog that I'm going to show you in a moment that was built by the Royal Society of London kind of in the mid-1850s, 1860s, and through the rest of the 19th century, which was one of the first big attempts to create a complete total catalog of all scientific papers. And I'm going to say more, and that in itself, to put it that way, it actually sounds kind of boring, but it's actually much more interesting than it turns out. I should say that this very short thing in Nature was kind of based on a much, much longer paper that if you're interested in this stuff, you might be interested in the longer version in a good proper history of science journal called How Lives Became Lists and Scientific Papers Became Data, Cataloging and Authorship in the 19th Century. Okay, I'm going to say a bit about this catalog and why I think it's interesting in ways that were indeed very surprising to me as I did this research. So this is the title page of the first volume of it. You can see the year on is 1867. There were 19 volumes in total, put out over the course of about 50 years or so, actually more than 50 years, 60 or 70 years, starting in 1867 and finishing in 1925. The catalog, this is what a typical page of the catalog looked like. It was an author-ordered catalog of papers. You can see this is sort of a kind of a random page with a bunch of authors who didn't publish very much, it appears. Each entry is numbered, which is interesting. Here's another page that's dedicated basically to Berzelius, who's a very, very important chemist in the 19th century. This is interesting because you see the end of his single-authored list. It's numbered up to 258, which is quite a number of publications. And then it starts to show his co-authored publications as separate numbered lists. And so that's kind of how the catalog worked. The reason it was done in stages, well, for several reasons. The idea was it was going to be a catalog that covered all papers during the 19th century, and a lot of work had to be done to sort of find all these papers. And the first 6 volumes covered up to 1863, which is about when they started cataloging in earnest. And then they created several more series to cover the rest of the 19th century. And it was author-ordered, and that's sort of how it worked. Now, I should say, I've known about this catalog since I started researching this way back in my dissertation. I used to think it was the most boring thing ever, because I was interested in search technologies. And this catalog seemed like it was pretty bad for finding information about any particular subject because it was author-ordered. Seeming much more interesting seemed like things that were subject-ordered, or had big classification systems that sort of group papers together on similar topics, et cetera, et cetera. And this didn't do that. They wanted to do that when they built this, but they never figured out how to do an efficient subject catalog, so they never did it. And so I've known about this for a long time, but I wasn't really interested in it until relatively recently. I was much more interested in this other catalog, lots of catalogs, this later catalog called International Catalog of Scientific Literature, which kind of got going in the late 19th century, but really only started publishing in 1901, 1902. This was a much bigger operation. It was an attempt to create both an author-ordered list and a subject-classified catalog of all scientific publications, papers. Actually, a couple of other things I didn't mention about this. One key thing is this catalog only dealt with papers and periodicals. That's key. No books were in this first catalog. This one, books were allowed in as well, but of course most stuff in it was indeed stuff from journals. It was based on international collaboration, which is very interesting. So let's see, what do we got here? I'll show you how that worked in a moment. It was split up into a bunch of different sciences. Each science had its own set of index cards or books. It was kind of it was actually, I think, the biggest intergovernmental organization focused on science in the late 19th, early 20th century. It was a massive, massive operation meant to capture all the original contributions to knowledge, and based on a classification system that they hoped would evolve over time through, so I should say that you guys are very interested in classifying here, I think, but usually through algorithmic means. There was not an algorithm here. This was people sitting down in rooms and hashing out what the classification should be. But there was a kind of big bureaucratic system set up for how that should work, because of course the Germans weren't going to agree with the French, and the French weren't going to agree with the British, et cetera, et cetera. So here were the various disciplines that were covered, and these were kind of done separately, and then very, very detailed classification schemes went along with each of these disciplines. This is what the administrative structure looked like. It was still connected to the Royal Society, sort of, but their hope was that it would have this life of its own. There was a central bureau in London, Executive International Council, regional bureaus across mostly Europe, but also various other places, including Japan and a lot of British colonies. And then these regional bureaus were sort of being advised by scientific societies of various disciplines to produce all of the, both producing sort of the classification system, but also all the data that would go into these catalogs on a yearly basis. Let's see. So this is where there were regional bureaus. So you can see it's mostly Europe, with a bunch of British colonies and a couple of other places thrown in as well. Let's see. Anyway, I thought this was really interesting because it was this attempt to account for what science is. around the turn of the 20th century in a way that nobody had ever attempted to do. It was an attempt to create huge amounts of data, and indeed to marshal that data in all sorts of ways. This was a moment where there was a lot of competition between nations, and it was the lead up to World War I. There's a term that some people have used to describe this era of internationalism. They use the term Olympic internationalism. Indeed, the Olympic Games comes from this period. So there's this idea that if you set up a system like this, particularly because it was organized by regional bureaus, rather than being organized, say, by discipline. You could imagine splitting it up by discipline and having different offices be in charge of a particular discipline. That happened at a lower level, but at the highest level, different countries were essentially indexing their own work, which made it very easy to compare the output of any particular nation. So you see here is one example of a kind of attempt to sort of just account for where's most of the stuff coming from. This is a publication in 1906. You can see in this case, by this point, Germany is way ahead of everybody else. That's slips received, that is to say, publications counted in this particular office, number of journals, average number of slips per journal.
Which is interesting. So Germany is the big gorilla, but the British are reading this effort. So how is
yes.
that?
Well, that's a very complicated story about, yeah, so that is a very interesting question. Indeed, the Germans almost didn't, well, so there's a very simple answer, really. The nations that tend to be most interested in international projects are not usually the nations that are the most important ones in any particular sphere.
Good point, yes.
Right.
Because they got everything internally.
Yeah, Germany doesn't care, actually, about this too much, actually, because, you know, they're quite happy doing their own thing. The British and the French, who, particularly them, because they sort of believe that historically they ought to be sort of, to some extent, and certainly the French, that they ought to be in the lead in some sense, are very interested in some kind of international collaboration. And indeed, they want to. The other thing that's going on now is there are many international projects of this sort getting going, and there's a lot of competition to be organizing that project for your particular country, right? So the kind of idea, the British will take this, the Germans can have a geodesy, et cetera, et cetera. And then there are there's a whole other story going on here with the other key places like Switzerland and Belgium, which are these centers of international work. And indeed, there's this whole other parallel project to this one being run by these crazy peace activist bibliographers in Belgium at the same time, and they're actually in competition. There's a whole other project basically doing the same thing. It's a weird, bizarre world. The point is, huge numbers of people are attempting to classify and catalog knowledge during the late 19th century. Anyway, I found all this very, very interesting. I was actually writing a dissertation on this. But then I kind of stopped, because all of a sudden I had a bunch of questions that couldn't be answered by this project. So this is the one that I'm kind of just talking about. Why are they doing this? It seems like crazy. I mean, well, you guys wouldn't think it's crazy, but you do. But in a way, it seems crazy and almost foolhardy at the time to do this. So why the interest in cataloging scientific literature? And why then, and why not so much earlier on? Why this huge effort then? And then the other question I was trying to figure out as I was wondering about this is, what exactly was being organized? There was a very easy slippage in the way people talked about this project between talking about organizing the literature and organizing knowledge itself, right? And keeping knowledge itself ordered. And that slippage was very interesting to me. So I became interested in when did it become easy to slip between organizing publications in this way and, say, organizing discovery claims, right? So the idea that there's an identity between a discovery and a publication, where does that idea kind of come from? And that you can almost, one publication equals one discovery kind of idea, which would make no sense at all in a world that was full of big, long books. Right? Because one big book would involve lots of discoveries, lots of claims, synthetic claims, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas a world in which there were lots and lots of papers, you could imagine this slippage between discovery on the one hand and a publication on the other, paper on the other. So I became very interested in that. And then, you know, the sort of obvious question after that is, under what conditions and when does it become thinkable to count papers as a surrogate for productivity? So these questions, I kind of realized that by the time the catalog, this scientific literature catalog was the consequence of something that had happened or was happening. And I became very, very interested in the story that came first. Indeed, the backstory of this is I was writing a dissertation on this thing, and I was writing the introduction, the sort of background history to this story, and then I realized that this introductory chapter, this sort of background history, was the real story, because a huge thing had happened that I hadn't realized had happened. And that was essentially the emergence of some conception of the modern scientific journal as we know it. which I had always kind of assumed was this thing that was pretty stable, back to the 17th century, the philosophical transactions, et cetera, et cetera. That was what the story that was told. And as I was doing this research, I realized this was completely false.
And why is that? You're going to tell us?
Well, I'll say a little bit.
Okay.
I'll say a little more about that. And then, yeah. All right. So then I realized that actually, so in trying to answer this question, there's several things that are required for this. And I realized that I can give interesting new answers to these kinds of historical questions. So when does it happen that a paper comes to be seen as an inherently valuable thing, rather than some ephemeral thing that you just throw away? Nowadays, you publish something in one of these big journals, as you often do here, and you make posters on your wall about it. You get very excited about it. And that was not always true, at least for a lot of the things that we consider now scientific journals. Publications need to have some sense that the thing you're counting is uniform enough. Now, we all know that some papers are way more important than others, way more important than others. But you have to have some notion that the thing you're counting is at least vaguely similar to the other things you're counting. So some sort of notion of uniformity is important. And then the third thing, which is very interesting to me, is you can't just count everything that is a possible publication if you're talking about the sciences. You need to demarcate the stuff that should count from the stuff that shouldn't count. And this requires a lot of work. This doesn't happen automatically. It's clearer to us now how these things work because of the infrastructures we have, but in the 19th century they didn't so much have these sorts of things. So in trying to answer these questions, I realized that this first catalog that I thought was boring was actually much more interesting. Because it's partly this catalog, this very simple sort of author-ordered list, was a witness to the emergence of this category, the scientific paper, and indeed a certain sense of the category of the scientific journal that was very important. Not only was it a witness to it, not only could you see it coming into formation through the work of the catalog, but the stronger argument is that the catalog itself actually had a hand in making this possible, actually had a hand in producing the idea that there is this thing called the scientific journal that is separate from other kinds of periodical publications, and that the things in it are meritorious objects, the things that are cataloged are meritorious, and that they're connected to particular authors in an important way. So the catalog didn't just account for the growth of scientific papers, but helped create the category of the scientific paper itself. And in a certain sense, the category of the scientific journal as we come to know it later on. So I'll just give you a few examples of the kinds of things I mean when I say that the building of the catalog is in some sense, it's a descriptive project that's trying to describe something that isn't quite there. But in trying to describe the thing that's there and sort of trying to squeeze it into this sort of category is actually having a normative effect on the way people think about this category that is kind of nascent. So this is just a fun little quotation from the preface to give you a sense of how different the system is from how the system of publishing is from what you might expect. So they write, if you read the preface, it's a rather it's both celebratory but exasperated preface by the people who put this thing together. They write, "No pains have been spared to assign the memoirs to their respective authors." Now, that's a weird thing to write because, of course, memoirs ought to be connected very easily to authors. But no, in fact, many papers and periodicals that were seemingly scientific journals did not have authors' names attached in unambiguous ways. In fact, there were many, many papers that were published either with no author's name attached, maybe initials, or different sorts of authors' sort of names floating around where it wasn't exactly clear who ought to take credit for this particular object. So that's one thing that was very different about many journals. Authorship wasn't connected to making a discovery claim in the way that we now see it often to be in at least academic sciences. And what's fun about this is that this was a problem for them, and they indeed had to do a lot of work to figure out who had published what, and sort of add authors' names onto things. So none but those who have been engaged in a task of this kind can form any idea of the difficulty occasioned by such omissions. It's hoped that this notice may have some effect in inducing contributors to scientific journals to give their names in full. So if only people would sign their papers, which is a fascinating thing because you would expect people to want to take credit for the things they publish. And we can talk a lot about why that wasn't the case. I won't go into why that wasn't always the case, but we're not going to go too much into it. The point is, this was, yeah.
Was there a notion at that time of copyright?
Okay, that's a huge, interesting question, yes. Well, there was.
Separate from the scientific paper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Copyright existed. What didn't exist in any meaningful way was international copyright. So in Britain, there was different nations had different copyright schemes.
Yeah.
They were very much in transition. So there was copyright. The other question is, patents and what situation is with patents. Copyright was pretty well established. There's a pretty good regime of copyright law in Britain by this point. Patents were still kind of up in the air to some extent. Well, by this point, they kind of figured it out, but patents were a huge question. How they should work was a huge question. What was just getting going around this moment was international copyright, which is huge for issues of science. Actually, that's something I forgot to mention about. I was going to say with the maybe we're going to get back to it. Actually, go back. Yeah. So one thing I didn't mention about this here is another interesting feature. If you look at, say, this particular entry or this particular entry, there are many different journal references for that particular title, right? Why is that? Because in fact, periodicals would routinely reprint, indeed often in translation, but not always in translation, reprint, excerpt, etc., a particular publication. There's no sense in which one publication belongs in one place and doesn't go anywhere else. Berzelius in particular, because he was Swedish, and wrote in Swedish often, sometimes in German, and he was famous, would be translated or reprinted in all sorts of different places. So rather than imagining the world in which a particular publication would, say, be published in London or in Stockholm or in Berlin and then sort of travel all over, that happened a little bit. But the other thing that happened is these different editors and societies were connected to one another and would receive each other's publications and then reprint various parts of them. Even within a particular nation, that could happen. So in terms of international copyright, it was a kind of an open Wild West. Even within a particular nation, that would happen. In particular, when a publication of a scientific society or academy had some sort of big memoir, these academy publications, society publications, were usually very expensive and they were prestigious, but they were expensive. So cheaper journals that were commercial would excerpt parts of them and publish them on their own. And this was a more controversial practice. In particular, because the other thing about these society journals is they were often very slow. Like sometimes they would only come out, I shouldn't even call them society journals, you'll see why in a moment. These society publications were slow, sometimes they only came out every 5 years. So it could happen that a publication was ready to be printed, and then the author would send a version of it to a commercial journal, and then it would be printed as a kind of reprint in the commercial journal, but hadn't actually come out yet in the place that it was originally meant for. So it was a big complicated thing, and when that happened, various societies got very upset. The Royal Society of London was very upset about this for various reasons. That's a whole other story. But yeah, there is copyright, but how it applies to periodicals is ambiguous. Because again, authorship and periodical texts don't go together quite in the, it's not so clear that a lot of authorship in periodical texts, as is still the case in newspapers in some sense, doesn't exactly belong to the author in the way that a book belongs to the author, at least in sort of moral property regimes, etc. Okay, so good question. Let's see. So this sort of issue of authorship leads to this question, so do people actually care about their publications at all, you might ask? And the answer is mostly yes, but it also just depends on what you exactly mean. And so as I was getting into this, I realized that these different kinds of publications that were getting into this catalog were perceived as different kinds of things by a lot of actors. And this is going to follow up on something I was just saying. What I'm showing you here is one of my favorite documents in the history of science. It's the preliminary list, or at least in the history of science that I studied, preliminary list of the journals to be indexed for the catalog of scientific papers. So this was put together in 1864 and then sent to a bunch of societies and individuals to say, what do you think? So what I like about this is it's kind of the first example of an attempt to create a demarcation between the publications that should count as proper scientific publications and everything else. Now, of course, there are many other periodicals that are about science that don't get onto this list. There's lots of journals that they would have themselves called popular science journals that don't count or aren't supposed to count. The problem is that the barrier between what's a pop science journal and what's a sort of proper research science journal was utterly porous. And so the way in which you actually make this division was highly, highly contested. And indeed, many of the publications, even on this list, had a sort of big pop sci section to them, particularly because if you were a commercial journal, you really were trying to make money. And it isn't the case as it is now, that there's a whole infrastructure of libraries that are willing to buy these things and sort of feel like they have to buy them. You're actually trying to sell these things to individuals, and so you're always going to be interested in things that are sort of kind of popular in some ways, at least in many countries. Certainly in Britain, a little less so in France, where there's more, the state is sort of bankrolling things a little more. But in a lot of places, certainly in the United States as well, being popular really matters. So anything that's a journal that's independent, connected to a commercial publisher, is going to have a kind of pop side aspect to it. The other thing to notice about this list that's really important, and I won't say too much about it, is that it's divided into two different kinds of things: journals and transactions. Now, when one says philosophical transactions of the blah, blah, blah society, one imagines those these days as journals. That was not true up to this point in the 19th century. Transactions were understood to be different kinds of things from journals. So everything you see here under journals were indeed produced by independent publishers and were commercial things. Transactions, transactions itself was being kind of loose because societies published transactions, and starting in the 1830s, they also published things called proceedings. We often speak of the proceedings of the Royal Society going back to the 17th century. That's not true. Proceedings, these which are kind of cheaper journals with shorter articles in them, only got going in the 1830s. And indeed, well, a big story about my book is how proceedings ended up helping to lead to the erasure of this distinction. But the point is, these things that were called transactions were indeed these often more expensive, prestigious publications. And if you published in transactions, you would indeed have your author's name attached. Whereas if you published in a journal, it was quite possible that there would be no author's name attached to articles. So journals work very, very differently. So one of the things that this catalog did that I realized was super important is it started to help to erase this distinction between journals and transactions. And there are a set of properties that journals had and a set of properties that transactions had. And as they blended together, they started to produce something like what we understand scientific journals to be now. And so that was very important. It's not that the catalog, did this single-handedly, but it was an index of the way in which these categories were starting to merge together by the mid-19th century, and it helped this process along through its own, through its existence, and through the work to actually produce this thing that I'm calling an information infrastructure. So let's see. A couple of ways to see that there were, at least through correlation, potential consequences, or at least that this was part of a real shift that was happening, is to look at the ways in which individuals made the case for their expertise as scientists. So you might look at things like CVs. Now, they weren't exactly CVs in the 19th century, at least not in Britain. They were sort of in France, interestingly, but they weren't in Britain. But there were election certificates. These were sort of the things you would fill out to make your case to be elected to a society. And the most prestigious society was the Royal Society. So you can look at election certificates. I was going to show you a whole bunch of these just sort of very quickly, but most of my copies of these don't look very good. But I have a few that are in much better shape. And so I'm just going to give you a couple to give you typical cases. 1850s, before the catalog, already a lot has happened in terms of what these things look like. And the Royal Society had the standardized sheet by this point. They got this going in around 1845 or so, I think, the standardized sheet. And you'll see that there's the qualifications. There are 4 listed: discoverer of, author of, inventor or improver of, distinguished for his acquaintance with the science of, and eminent as of, so there's actually 5. So that you would sort of list what your qualifications are. What's cool is that by the 1850s, claims about authorship do indeed predominate. But if you look at how authorship is listed, it's usually discursively like this. I don't know if you can read that from back there, but it's just a kind of paragraph saying, I've authored these various works on these subjects, blah, 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 blah. And it's kind of fun because he's written across the various different categories. He's only doing authorship. But the things he lists are not almost ever journals. They're either books or they're transactions. And that's very common. In the 1850s, you'll find almost nobody listing a single journal article as a qualification. Sorry, of course I had it bigger, you could have read it like this. So now you can read it, sorry. Numerous papers have been published from time to time in the Transactions of the British Association, Memoirs of the Literary and Philosophical Society of Manchester, Transactions of the Civil Institute of News. You see transactions, no journals. By the 1870s, this happens amazingly quickly. Things really sort of change. By 1878, almost all of them look kind of like this. And there are several things to notice. you have a true list.
Precise reference.
Pardon me?
You actually keep all the
Exactly,
numbers.
exactly. So you get a list with the actual bibliographical information, and you have both transactions and journal type publications here. So it looks much different. In fact, this one has, we continued on slip. This person added an extra slip with more publications, and indeed, you might even at this point sort of give a bunch of off-puts to the society of your publications. But what seemed to be most important was the list. Here's one more example.
And this was filled out by the person who was partitioning the report, rather than recommended as it is now.
Well, yeah, so, let's see, so this is what the sheet looked like. It seems to me that the way it worked is, even though you are being recommended by these people.
Yes, you still have to write your own credentials.
You would still write your own credentials, even though the how shall I say it, formally you're being recommended by people, but in fact you are behind the scenes engineering your own campaign.
Yes.
This is essentially how it goes.
Collecting your own signatures. Isn't it like collecting all these signatures from different people in different towns, right? Was kind of a challenge itself, right?
Yeah, so there's, I mean...
Or they met at the meeting and they would sign it.
So if I were to show you these from the early 19th century, and I could, except I have low-res versions of those, this portion would be very short, and it would all be about the signatures. And it, essentially, to get elected as the Royal Society in the early 19th century was about who you knew, almost entirely.
Still like that.
Well, yeah, so now it's like that, but there's everything's always like that in all spheres in some sense, you might say. But there's at least, how shall we say, a veneer of some sort of notion that this is a meritocracy, right? Whereas the idea that it was a meritocracy in the way we understand it was not really operating in the early 19th century. It really was about who you knew, now it's sort of served, everybody knows behind the scenes it's about who you knew. Yeah. At the time, it was, that was what it was about. It was about who you knew. And if you didn't know the right people, then you deserved not to be in the Royal Society. So what I would say, there was a shift from there being a kind of patronage systems sort of persist, but patronage systems go from being very public and acknowledged to being to private and sort of secret. So that's a shift that occurs over this period. Yeah.
But if it was just that patronage, then why get people to write their discoveries and public, like, what function was that serving? Was it purely symbolic?
No, yeah. So by what I'm saying is that by the 1840s and 1850s, the idea that it ought to be based on meritocracy is very much alive, very, very present, very explicit. Indeed, there's a whole, I could say more about this, I won't. Around 1830, there's a whole big revolt within the Royal Society itself to say, let's stop making this about social capital, let's make this about meritocracy. And there are several reasons for that. It's the same time that there's a big political reform going on in Britain, shifting away from the idea that the Parliament is full of basically landowners and people of high social capital to people who are actual sort of representatives, right? So this sort of idea is happening politically, and it's happening in science as well. The idea that the Royal Society ought not to be an old boys network of people who are powerful and kind of interested in natural philosophy. Rather, it should be a representation of scientific experts.
Yeah. Should we assume that in the earlier model where it was who you knew, should we assume that it was strictly based on geographic location, whether you taught at the same school, you worked together, or indeed, would not those journal articles serve as an introduction to get you into the social network? So that if someone saw a paper you wrote, they thought it was very interesting, they would like to make your acquaintance, etc., and now you're in the club.
Well, it basically didn't tend to work that way. It's a very good question. There's several issues surrounding. I mean, the main way in which you would be in the club would be through your social hierarchy. Pardon me?
Peerage?
Well, yeah, so if you're a peer, that's quite something. But if you were simply if you're a gentleman, if you're of the aristocracy, if you were, your station in society was huge here. Interestingly, on the point about, your journal, I mean, again, it would not be journal, what does shift in the 1820s and 1830s is if you've published in the philosophical transactions itself, that's a good thing, but almost nothing else. Indeed, famously, there were two big commercial journals in the early 19th century, science journals in the early 19th century in Britain. One was called the Philosophical Magazine, and the other was called the Journal of Natural Philosophy. The editors of those two journals could not get themselves into the Royal Society And it was partly because they were editors of those two journals, because they were commercial men making a profit. And that was seen as problematic. So they're actually kept out. What happens in the 20s and 30s and 40s is people start to say, this sucks, and we need to find a way. Well, so the key person, the most famous person for this is Charles Babbage, who says, well, he's actually pretty high station himself, but he's like, Britain ought to take science more seriously, and if we're going to take, and the state ought to actually fund science, and the way to do that is to give grants to people who are good scientists, where they use the word scientist, they use natural philosopher. And so we need a way for the state to be able to recognize who counts as a good natural philosopher. And so they start try to find a way to make the Royal Society a representation of meritocracy. And this, the very existence of this standardized form is one of the results of that process. And indeed, it's at that moment that one possibility of saying authorship should count starts to take off. But there's a lot of problems with it, precisely because journal articles are, again, they're not seen as particularly meritorious things. Yeah.
What's the difference between the columns, general knowledge and personal knowledge?
Yeah, that's essentially you see, this one is empty. It's often empty. General knowledge would be, not actually knowing the person, but knowing them for their work. Or for pardon me?
That's the question.
Well, yeah, not here, right?
Yeah, it is. No one's there. Only the bodies are there.
It's a very interesting form because it's a hybrid situation, right? The issue of who you know still matters here a lot. At the same time, there's some sort of claim that meritocracy also matters. And one of the key points about this, if we go to this second one that if we go to these 1870s ones, you'll notice that now we've got these lists. And indeed, these lists become very, very standard, right? Everybody has these lists. So you might think that this is the rule, that you have to have a list of your publications. But there was never any change in the rules, no change in the bylaws. But it was widely believed by the end of the 19th century that if you want to apply to the Royal Society for membership, you have to give them a list of publications. All of this happened simply through what people, but none of that was true. What's that?
The grapevine, right?
Exactly. People just believed that this is what they needed to do, and so this is what they did. They also probably knew, in many cases, that of course the other thing they need to do is to know the right people, right? Because you could be blackballed, which is to say, if enough powerful people say you shouldn't be voted for, people won't vote for you, and you won't get in. So it was, what you see in a document like this, it continues to be, sorry, I should have, because of the way I've done this, you can't see, those columns still exist in the 1870 case, in which you have the sort of signatures of people. And personal knowledge still wins out over general knowledge, even though you might think that general knowledge is what you got, right? That's not at all how they tended to see it. Okay, so where are we here? Anyway, other consequences, so the moment this catalog comes out, and this is sort of what this little article is about, this catalog is produced, as I say, it's sort of an interesting index of the changing status of these journals, but what's funny is that it was very much made as a search tool. The rationale behind its construction was that we need to know what papers are out there so we know what's been written on what topic, et cetera, issues of priority, getting scooped, blah, blah, blah. But what people end up using it for almost immediately, at least in the sort of archival record, is to compare publication counts of individuals. And I found this very striking, and indeed, it led to, it seems to me it's connected to the phenomenon of people listing their papers in this way. People start to imagine that publication counts matter in a way that they didn't used to matter. And I find this interesting because it suggests that the very production of an infrastructure through which you can measure the thing has an effect on the way people think about that thing itself. And that I find very fascinating. One of the sort of funnest examples of this, and there aren't a lot of examples of this kind of thing at this moment, but the fact that there are any is kind of interesting. This is an Austrian geologist, Hedinger, who found all of this fascinating, and he did all kinds of work on the catalog. And he sort of tried to find it, even though the catalog wasn't organized by region or nation or whatever, he tried to find some way in which he could compare productivity across nations. And so he created this very weird metric, whereby he went through all the volumes of the catalog that had been published so far, and he counted all the individuals who had at least 50 publications, and he sort of added them up. And this is what he got to compare nations. And you see what's interesting here, kind of shocking, but you would maybe expect, even by sort of the mid-19th century, for Germany to really be number one here. But it isn't. France and Belgium is, which is kind of interesting. So it's kind of an early attempt to do a kind of scientific metric across nations. And even this stuff is kind of interesting in ways you might not expect. I would say, so what I want to submit to you is that this tells you much less than you might expect about productivity across nations. It tells you much more about how people published in these different nations. So to give you an example of how that works, this is a I do very little data. This is one example of data that I do. I just sort of counted up the number of references in the catalog, at least the first series of the catalog, to different publications. And this is the top 20 or so. And you'll find that this thing called the compte rendu hebdomadaire has way more entries than anything else. And then there's a few other interesting things to say about this. But the point is, and indeed the next highest one is also a French publication. And mostly that's because the French, the compte rendu was made of very, very short articles. And indeed, actually, this is number one, even though the publication only starts in 1835. So it sort of dominated the catalog unlike any other institution. And indeed, the French were known for wanting to publish a lot and very quickly. They got criticized a lot for always trying to, they had this term called sort of taking priority. They would publish quickly to take their priority, and they would publish in short little things. And this compte rendu was a special kind of new publication. It was one of these things like the proceedings thing that was new in the 1830s and really sort of changed science. But then the rest of this list here, at least, these are all commercial journals. And if you remember that preliminary list I showed you, it was mostly made of transactions, in fact. Journals were a smaller part of it. But when you actually look at what publications make up most of the catalog, it's these journal things. And the journals, again, they were commercial usually, and they had a lower status than these transactions. But that sort of started changing. There was a hand up. Yep.
Yeah, just reflecting, you're mapping a transition from qualitative to quantitative meritocracy. Do you find that the people in that era were questioning or were critiquing that, like we do still today in some degrees, that not all papers are equal?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it is a transition from qualitative to quantitative, but even that almost sells it short, I would say, because what constitutes qualitative is really sort of at play as well, as we were discussing, right? But for quantitative, there's very little to go on, so there's not as much, but there's a lot of play even in the question of qualitative, I would say. Because it's not so clear that publishing at all, even sort of reading publications might not be the best way to decide who's a good scientist. There might be other means of contributing to science, the sort of invisible technicians who don't get into publications, et cetera, that might matter than being sort of paid over here. But to answer your actual question, yes, there are a fair number of instances of when, well, there's a few things to say here. It should be said that people aren't officially using these numbers at this time for matters of high rating evaluation, except in the case of the certificates. But even there, they're just listing publications. There's no actual talk of counting them to decide who should get in and who shouldn't get in. That's kind of, it's sort of floating around behind the scenes as something that matters. You see it, one of the best ways in which it comes out, besides in terms of the counting, is looking at things like obituaries and sort of biographies of a scientific career, where people start to number the publications, give them counts. And in those contexts, there wouldn't be any reason to criticize it, because it's that amongst various other things. But when people do make the claim, which they occasionally do, that we should use these counts for some more official purpose, then indeed the criticism is made. That's what about the quality of these publications? That aspect of things, you know, I like to historicize everything and say everything's changed. That's about the same now as it is then, almost, I would say, right? People are always criticizing quantitative stuff and saying, but what you should actually pay attention to is the quality. The nature of the critique at that time seems to me very similar to what it is now, I think. An interesting moment in that conversation seems to be happens when citation indexing comes online, because there a new sort of situation arises in which one can make a claim that you can use quantitative measurements to decide about quality, which is not happening here. But with citation analysis, one of the things that happens in those sort of late 60s, early 70s, when that starts to come online as a means of proceeding, is this paper counting sucks. Why should we not use it? We should use qualitative measures. And there is a qualitative measure that we can count, and that's citations. So there you get a kind of more interesting, complicated conversation. All right, so let me skip over that. All right, so this is why I thought that I probably talked too long already. Shall we Well, I'll finish this little bit. We can skip the citation analysis stuff. The sort of bigger, so I sort of figured this out, that actually this catalog sign of papers and sort of analyzing how it worked and how it got put together and how it was responded to was really interesting. Of course, behind that was this question about the journal and what it was and where it came from and how it changed. And that's sort of what I ended up, I started with these questions about search and evaluation, and I realized that there was this sort of secret story that what we understood journals to be, even though they existed more or less during the 19th century, completely changed in ways that were utterly consequential for how we understand science to work. And so I realized that sort of there's this old story that I've called the heroic narrative in the scientific journal. There's this story you'll read in various places, it's still very popular and present, that modern science, experimental science, really gets going in the 17th century, basically, maybe the 16th century, but especially the 17th century. And one of the key sort of aspects to make it possible, sort of public knowledge, is the emergence of the journal, a whole sort of publishing apparatus that allows knowledge to spread quickly in an informal way, et cetera, et cetera. The sort of hero of this narrative is this fellow named Henry Oldenburg, who was the first editor of the Philosophical Transactions, which is usually connected to the Royal Society. And it's sort of an in-house publication, but it's not technically an in-house publication. It's actually a commercial journal at first run by Oldenburg. And this is, and the idea is out there that basically this journal was, even real historians, at least a few decades ago, would make the claim that this journal started the system as we know it, and it essentially was the system as we know it now. And in particular, you'll see many, many claims that peer review starts with this journal, that things like the relationship between authorship and discovery start with this journal, the use of a journal to make a priority claim starts with this journal, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea that it's all there, registration, distribution, quality control, it's all there. Basically, all of this turns out not to be true. It's all basically a myth. This journal did exist. It had some characteristics that are kind of like today, but mostly not. It was kind of a newsletter. Oldenburg himself called himself the author of the journal, and indeed he wrote most of it. He wrote about discoveries. He put in excerpts from letters and things like that. So it's a very different kind of thing. And if you want to find these sorts of things really arising, these sorts of qualities, you mostly have to look to the 19th century. So this is the book that is coming out in a few months is about how that stuff actually happened during the 19th century. And so I ended up writing more about the journal than I did about these catalogs. And you do see the emergence in the 19th century of referee systems as we would recognize them today. You do see the emergence of the idea that publication in a print periodical with author's name attached is central to, is crucial to priority claims and things like that, et cetera, et cetera. So that sort of, there's a lot to be said about that. I'm not going to say too much about it. But that's what I ended up working on. Now, I'm back to the catalog question and the search technology question. I've become very sort of re-interested in this question of how do the emergence of these information infrastructures, often that start out for purposes of search, how do they become tools that are used in the context of evaluation for measuring science and things like that. So a few consequences just to summarize the stuff I've been talking about. During the 19th century, these key categories that we assume are relatively stable are not so stable. The scientific paper, the scientific journal, what they mean is sort of in the process of formation. I'd say that's true of the 20th century as well, but it's really true of the 19th century. So if you're going to use them as measures of things, you should be very careful. This is something I haven't said too much about, but I think it's true, and I'd have to say a lot more to make the claim. But what a discovery is, in some sense, is being shaped by the emergence of these new formats, genres, information infrastructures. And one of the sort of key places to look for these changes over time are not simply in the formats and genres, but in the catalogs that we imagine as sort of just cataloging a thing that's already out there. The catalogs and the databases themselves, indeed, the kind of work you do here potentially is shaping what's going on in the research world itself in ways that are, I won't get into too much, but actually are in ways that are, some of it is obvious, but some of it is actually a lot more subtle. Some of it is simply that, of course, when you come up with a new evaluative metric, that's going to change the way people behave. That's kind of obvious. There's a sociological term for that that comes in part, well, there's several sociological terms. One of the first ones, and it's not so well known now, is called goal displacement, which comes from bureaucratic theory in the early 20th century connected with Merton. These days, what is it, gold, what's the law, the gold, what's the law about sort of forgetting, when a metric becomes a
Gold
target.
standard.
No. Is it Goldfar's law? Not Goldfar's law. You guys, you must know this. When a metric becomes a target, it ceases to be a good metric. What's the law for that? It's Goldfarb, Goldhaber, or something like that. I'm forgetting. Anyway, the point is, you make something. When a metric becomes something people try to play to, it changes. It ruins the metric. So that's obvious. But there's something a little more subtle that I haven't said too much about here that is also going on, which is that when you attempt to measure outputs for something like science, it's a tricky business because so the concept of goal displacement starts from the idea that science has some sort of goal, and when you come up with sort of surrogate markers of it, you sort of subtly change the goals of the actors involved. But science is tricky because the goals of science are always uncertain, right? There's no pure goal in science because there's no pure conception of discovery, no pure anything. So the sort of idea that sort of you have goal displacement where a kind of surrogate marker for evaluation purposes changes from one particular pure goal to something that's a little less pure doesn't quite work because the very conception of what science is about is partly constituted by these systems and information infrastructures. It's sort of central to the way people discuss who's a scientist, who isn't, et cetera, et cetera. So there's something actually a little more subtle going on in the ways in which these sorts of information infrastructures have what I would call sort of political consequences for how science is sort of imagined by a sort of broader populace. That's a whole other conversation that I'm going to stop now on, because I imagine I've probably talked already too long. But I can say lots about citation analysis if you want me to, if you want to talk about it, but I'll stop for now.
Sure, thank you. Let me open up for questions.
At what point did journals started to charge authors for publication? Why did those authors let that happen?
So say it again?
When did journals started to charge authors for publication?
Well, some aspect of that is variable, in fact. And again, it depends on, so commercial journals are very different in this regard in the 19th century from the transactions. This is one of those things that ends up sort of merging. In the case of transactions, it could happen in the 19th century that, for instance, if you wanted to publish something with a lot of illustrations, you may very well pay for those illustrations to be published.
That hasn't changed.
Yeah, right, exactly. So there might be a moment in which it sort of got lesser, I don't know. But certainly in the 19th century, that was common enough. So it could very well happen even during the 19th century. More systematic instance of sort of being charged to publish. This I'm not so sure about. I think it's a 20th century phenomenon, and I actually don't know the genealogy. I should say that, on the other hand, on the journal side of the question, the opposite is the case. So especially in certain places like Germany, but even well into the 20th century, you would be paid for your academic publications, sometimes by the page. And indeed, in Germany, it was actually a way to make a living still. You would publish academic articles, and so one consequence of this is that in German contexts, articles were, many German papers were very long in the early 20th century, because basically, by the early 20th century, you had a situation in place in which lots of libraries were buying these publications and felt compelled to buy them. And so German authors were getting paid by the page, and the publishers of these journals were just charging subscription rates based on how much they published. So in fact, you had very big articles, and there was a big revolt among librarians, library associations and universities in the 20s and 30s about this phenomenon. But the point is, the story about actually having to pay is one that I actually don't know the precise details of, but the very systematic use of that situation is clearly a 20th century phenomenon. Once you have situations in which scientists have money from grants that they could actually use to pay for this kind of thing. So it's not something that's going on in a systematic way. It's happening in the 19th century, but only in situations in which you have just rich people wanting to get things published. And societies are always looking for ways to save money on their these societies, they're by far their biggest cost is the publications that we produce. Printing, and especially illustrations, which are handly produced. And if they're colored, they're hand colored, they're usually not colored, are really expensive. And that's their biggest cost for the most part, because they often have space donated by the government and things like that. So they're very willing to take money from authors authors to publish stuff. But that's not happening in the case of journals. It's only happening in the case of transactions.
Is it true in this era that Germany was still the center of science and that you would have to write your papers in German to be really noticed in the community?
That depends on your discipline, right? So certain fields, certain physics fields, et cetera, that would be true. That's mostly not true in the era I'm talking about, even in most fields in the 19th century, precisely because the idea exists. So there's a few things going on. One is that papers are being translated. So especially in German, one thing that the Germans are doing that I haven't talked about here, but is a huge story, is the production of these things called Jahresberichte, sort of annual reports, which are these kind of sort of bibliographical, sort of opinionated, sort of reviews of an annual progress in the discipline. And they're taking in not only German stuff, but other things as well. And so, there are ways to find things out about fields in which the Germans are figuring they can deal with other languages and they're getting these publications. So there are ways to do it. There's a lot of translation going on. It becomes a bigger problem in the 20th century with certain fields, I think. That sort of story is more of for the most part, a 20th century, early 20th century story, I think. And then, of course, eventually the situation changes and English becomes a big language and there's a transition that happens. And the English, I think, are ultimately worse than the Germans were at paying attention to non-English publications, I think. So I think, again, when people make that claim, so it's true that, say, British physicists would have made that claim in the late 19th century, and it's sort of true, but it's also just sort of paranoia, I think. And the same would be true for certain other languages and other sorts of fields. So it's more true for more fields in Germany, but there are other fields in which a lot of action is happening in French, a lot of action is happening in English. Germany never dominated the way English dominates now. That's my. There's a book about this that came out recently. That if you're interested in this question, has a lot more information than I can give you here. Called Silent Babel. It's by Michael Gordon. Very readable. It's about the history of sort of scientific language, and it's sort of about how we moved from a Latin world to a kind of polyglot world for a while. Then the rise of kind of national scientific languages like Russian. So, for instance, Russian scientists tended to write in German or French until a certain point, then they started writing in Russian. And then the rise of the idea of artificial languages like Esperanto to solve these problems, and then the coming to dominance of English. So it's a kind of interesting arc of things. So it's a good question. Yeah.
Two-part question. So one is, I'm curious about the part of the presentation you didn't get to. I guess all the citation stuff, which I imagine everybody's pretty interested in. I wonder if you could just give us a little preview for in 30 seconds of what you didn't get to.
Yeah,
A and B. My sort of naive kind of understanding of the story of quantification of science was that it's pretty modern thing, perhaps with the explosion of big science post-war, and now we have the sort of an ending of block grants and stuff. So now we have to count everything and compare. I'm sort of getting the takeaway here that is not such a new thing.
No, you're mostly right. I mean, any old question like when did something happen historically has 7 different answers, right? The sort of massive interest in quantification these days and the tools with which to do it are mostly new, right? The idea that one might quantify the sciences and the beginning of production of tools through which one might do it is older, and that's sort of clear from this. The idea that you're going to use these sorts of tools to decide what to fund in a sort of really systematic way, that happens much, much later. So part of the sort of citation story is sort of about that, right? Let me see. Without going, I don't want to get too much into it, but so the story that I'm starting to sort of work out with the citation stuff is that there's kind of these sort of 3 nodes in the story. One is the invention of this infrastructure. The other is the rise of empirical sociology of science in the United States. And third is the emergence of science indicators. Now, this story is kind of different in different sorts of places. The story I'm telling is mostly an Anglo-American story, especially if it's an American story. There's, you guys will know about sort of other antecedents of sort of a science of science, a quantitative science of science in Poland, in Russia. There's a big sort of UK thing going on. What's sort of distinctive about this is the emergence of this technology. This is the database essentially of citation data, which kind of changes the situation where people can start to imagine new ways to quantify the output of science. And that sort of allows, all this happens, what's funny about the story is all these things happen kind of independently, and yet they kind of merge together and are self-supportive. So in the United States, it's in the 60s, so after World War II, huge amounts of funding go into science, right? Huge amounts of funding, the whole situation changes. By the late 60s, there's starting to be pullback on that, right? And funding is getting harder to get, et cetera, and Congress is getting much tighter in how it's going to sort of, in the kind of leash it has something like the NSF on and the NIH on. So the NSF and the NIH get very interested in coming up with data to show the output, the outcome, the output of what they've accomplished with the funding that they've got. And the kind of data that they're most interested in is quantified data. The model is explicitly sort of economic indicators and things like that. And so the idea arises to create something called science indicators, which would be quantitative measures of scientific output. That's sort of the origin of the science and technology indicators that still exist today. But for that to make any kind of sense, they had data before, but it was mostly data about the scientific workforce, money put into science. It was very hard to quantify scientific stuff in terms of the outputs. And citation data became a means to imagine how that might happen. And so there's lots and lots of talk about how to do that. So this happens at the same time that this thing is getting going. And sort of the other sort of interesting factor is that involved in all of this is sociologists and historians, because they're both kind of vouchsafing and giving legitimacy to the tools and infrastructures themselves, saying this is indeed workable and legitimate, but they are also sort of producing for themselves a program of research through the infrastructures and through what's seen as sort of the importance of this of science indicators for sort of defending science in this sort of tightening economic situation. So that's kind of the grand sort of the big story. Again, it's a similar story in which the other aspect of this that I'm not talking about is that the Science Citation Index starts out again as a kind of, it's supposed to start out as a kind of search technology, but then the sort of standard narrative is it kind of gets hijacked for purposes of evaluation. That's the story you often hear. And I think that's not exactly true. I think that the way in which Garfield originally got funding and all that was precisely because it was known that this technology would be useful for purposes of evaluation from the get-go. And evaluation was very useful precisely because of this issue, wanting to make the claim. So he's getting funding from the NSF and NIH. NSF and NIH are very concerned about this issue of making their claim to the state. And so that's sort of there from the beginning. So it's an evaluation technology right away, even though the real sort of payoff of it comes a little bit later in the 1970s. So the Science Citation Index emerges early 60s. Impact factors really go in early 70s. But citation analysis and sort of more sort of behind-the-scenes uses of it are going on much earlier than that. And Garfield himself is behind the scenes advocating for it in ways that he's never public about until the late 60s.
Cool. All right. Well, this is probably a good moment. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.